Hello everybody. In this Swift programming tutorial, we're going to go over the filter function. Let's go ahead and jump right into our first example. Now, one way we could filter an array of numbers would look something like this. We could create an empty array. We'll call it evens. We'll make it of type int. Then we could use a for-in loop through an array of numbers. Then, based on some criteria, in this case, we want to include only the evens, or filter for the evens. So we can use an if statement. And if I is evenly divisible by 2, which will tell us if it is even, we can append that number to our evens empty array. So now, if we use a print to display the evens, it should include only the numbers 2 and 4, which are the even numbers in this array. Let's go ahead and run it. And we do get 2 and 4 down in the console. Now you might notice that's not a whole bunch of code, but you can use the filter function basically to do this same thing with a little bit less code. So let's go over how to do that. We're going to go ahead and use this array for our examples. So the first thing we want to do, let's go ahead and create a variable. Let's call it evens filter. Then we're going to use our numbers array and then a dot to access the filter function. Now we can use a closure. Let's use our shorthand syntax to refer to the values that we're going to use for our filter function. And if any of those values are evenly divisible by 2, which will give us the evens, we want the filter function to return those. Let's go ahead and use a print and put in our evens filter variable. Let's run it. And again, we should get all the evens in the console, and you can see that we do. Now, one quick note regarding closures before we move on, and if this doesn't make perfect sense to you right now, no worries, we're going to do a tutorial on closures in the near future. One thing that is worth pointing out is that closures can take many forms to do the same thing. However, in general, their basic form looks like this. Okay, so you state your parameters or the arguments that the closure will work with, and then put in your statements or what you're going to do. Now, as we mentioned, you don't have to use this form because there are many forms a closure can take and still work, just as you have seen here. But to keep it real simple, I like to think of the parts needed to create a closure to include the arguments it will take, or the parameters, and then what you want to do with those arguments. So in this case, you can think of these as the parameters or the arguments it will take. And then what we wanted to do here is see if it was evenly divisible by 2 to give us the evens only. So let's move on and use our filter function to filter for odds. Let's go ahead and create our variable. Let's call it odds filter. Let's assign our numbers array, and we're going to use the filter function again. Let's put in our closure, and we're going to use a slightly different closure syntax here. However, for the most part, it still follows these rules. So let's create our parameter, or the arguments it will work with. We'll say x, in, x, and now we're going to state what we want to do with the arguments. And very similar to the evens, we can use the mod 2. However, instead of double equal sign, here we want to say not equals. So if it's not evenly divisible by 2, this should give us back the odds. Let's go ahead and print out the results. So we should get the odd numbers in this array. Let's go ahead and run it. And you can see here in the console, we get back all of the odd numbers in the numbers array. Next up, let's use the filter function to help us find all of the numbers greater than some number. Let's go ahead and create our variable. Let's call it greater than. Let's use our numbers array, the filter function. Let's put in our closure, and this time let's use the $0 shorthand syntax, and we want to filter for any numbers greater than 20. So in this array, that should be 25 and 50. Let's go ahead and run it. And you can see down here in the console, we get back what we expected, 25 and 50. Now just to show you, if you wanted to use this syntax, in this closure here, instead of the $0, that should work as well. So let's go ahead and try that. We'll say x in, x, if x is greater than 20, go ahead and return it. Let's run it again. And it seems to work just fine. We get back what we expected, 25 and 50. For our last example, let's go ahead and use the filter function again, very similar to this example. However, we also want to use the filter function in combination with another function. Okay, so what we want to do is filter out any of the numbers greater than 20, and then we want to add those together or get a sum. So let's create our variable. We'll call it sum greater than. Let's go ahead and use our numbers array. We'll use our filter function. We'll use our closure. We'll use the x in x syntax. Now again, you can think of this first part as the parameter or the argument it will work with. And then you can think of this part as what you want to do with those parameters or arguments. So if any of the values are greater than 20, go ahead and return those. That should be 25 and 50. And to sum those up, we can use the reduce function. So outside your closure, put a dot and access reduce. And then inside the reduce round brackets, we want to put our start point, which is 0. And we will go over the reduce function in much more detail in a future tutorial. But for now, let's start at 0. And what do we want it to do? We want it to add. So we just put in a plus sign. Let's go ahead and use a print to display. And if we have set this up correctly, this code here should filter out any numbers greater than 20 in our array here. And then it should use the reduce to add those together. So that should be 25 and 50 added together, which gives us 75. Let's go ahead and run it. And you can see down here in the console, we get back the correct answer, which is 75. We're good to go. Okay, so that's all we have for this tutorial on the Swift filter function. We will be doing many more Swift tutorials in the near future. Join us for those, and we'll see you next time.